There are moments in life when you enter a room and feel it at once. Eyes turn toward you, conversations pause ever so slightly, and yet no one speaks. No praise, no criticism, only silence. And you wonder why. It is tempting to believe such moments are about appearance, confidence, or chance. But more often, they are about difference. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that cannot be ignored. Human beings are remarkably sensitive creatures. We notice when something does not fit neatly into our familiar categories. When someone lives with unusual discipline, speaks with restraint, or walks with purpose instead of haste, it disrupts the invisible agreements we make with ourselves about how life is supposed to be lived. Silence, in this case, is not emptiness. It is recognition without understanding. Many people stare and say nothing because words would require honesty. To speak would mean admitting that they see something in you, a clarity, a resolve, a refusal to conform that reminds them of what they postponed, abandoned, or never dared to begin. You see, confrontation does not always arrive as an argument. Sometimes it arrives as a person. This is why those who strive to live intentionally often feel isolated without being alone. They are observed, measured, and quietly compared against. And comparison, when it reveals uncomfortable truths, prefers silence over speech. But let us be careful here. To be noticed is not proof of superiority. It is proof of responsibility. If you are watched, it is not because you are flawless, but because your life suggests that another way is possible. And that suggestion carries weight. It challenges excuses. It unsettles complacency. It asks questions without ever opening its mouth. That is why misunderstanding follows such people closely. Depth is rarely explained in a glance, and conviction often appears strange to those who live by impulse. The world is quick to admire results, but slow to respect the quiet discipline that produces them. You may be stared at because you refuse to laugh at what degrades you, because you do not rush where others panic, because you build when others complain, because you carry peace where chaos is expected. And still, they say nothing. Do not mistake their silence for rejection, nor their attention for approval. Both are unreliable measures. The true measure lies in whether you remain faithful to what you know is right when no one applauds and no one explains. The danger for the so-called chosen is not opposition, it is pride. The moment you believe the attention makes you special, you lose the very quality that made you noticeable, humility anchored in purpose. You are not called to impress the watchers. You are called to live truthfully, steadily, and with integrity, especially when misunderstood. So let them stare. Let them remain silent. Your task is not to be understood by everyone, but to be consistent in character, clear in conscience, and brave in action. History is shaped not by those who spoke the loudest, but by those whose lives quietly asked better questions and lived the answers. And that more than words is why they watch you. Silent attention is rarely accidental, and it is almost never meaningless. When people look at you longer than politeness requires, and yet offer no comment, they are not acting randomly. Human beings are trained, often unconsciously, to ignore what fits neatly into their expectations. The familiar passes unnoticed because it demands no adjustment. But when something disrupts those expectations, when a person does not behave, speak, or carry themselves according to the unwritten rules of the environment, attention is naturally drawn. Silence follows because the mind is working, measuring, and trying to make sense of what does not immediately align with what it already believes to be normal. This kind of attention often arises from a subtle disturbance, not an obvious one. You may not be doing anything dramatic or attention-seeking. In fact, it is often restraint, not display, that draws the gaze. Calm in a hurried world feels strange. Discipline in a culture of excess feels confrontational. Purpose in a place driven by distraction feels almost threatening. People sense these differences before they can explain them, and because they lack the language to describe what they feel, they choose to observe rather than speak. Silence becomes a place of safety where they can look without committing to a judgment. Another reason silent attention is not accidental is that it exposes inner conflict. When someone notices in you a quality they once admired in theory but never practiced, the reaction is rarely admiration out loud. Speaking would require them to acknowledge that such a life is possible, and that acknowledgement brings with it responsibility. It is easier to look quietly than to admit, even to oneself, that one's own habits, choices, or compromises are being challenged. In this sense, your presence does not accuse anyone directly, yet it acts as a mirror. And mirrors, when they show uncomfortable truths, are rarely thanked. There is also the reality that people fear mislabeling what they sense. When something is unfamiliar, naming it incorrectly feels risky. If they praise you and later discover they were wrong, they feel foolish. If they criticize you and realize you were sincere, they feel unjust. Silence, therefore, becomes a cautious middle ground. They watch to gather evidence. They wait to see whether your consistency confirms what their instincts suggest. True character, after all, reveals itself over time, not in moments. Quiet observation is how many people test whether what they see is real or merely a passing performance. Silent attention is also tied to hierarchy and insecurity. In many social environments, speaking first is seen as a form of vulnerability. To comment is to reveal one's position, values, or assumptions. When someone senses strength, clarity, or inner stability in another person, they may hesitate to expose themselves through speech. Silence allows them to maintain control while still engaging from a distance. The stare, then, is not dominance but caution. It is the behavior of someone who feels unsettled yet unwilling to admit it openly. It is important to understand that this attention is not always admiration, nor is it hostility. Often it is curiosity mixed with uncertainty. People are trying to determine whether your difference is genuine, sustainable, or worth respecting. They are asking unspoken questions: is this person disciplined or simply rigid, confident or unaware, purposeful or detached? These questions cannot be answered quickly, so words are withheld. Observation becomes the chosen language. Recognizing that silent attention is not accidental protects you from two common errors. The first is assuming rejection, which leads to unnecessary self-doubt and the temptation to shrink yourself to regain comfort. The second is assuming superiority, which leads to pride and isolation. In reality, the attention says less about your worth and more about the effect your presence has on the emotional and moral atmosphere around you. It means something in you has disrupted the ordinary flow, and disruption always invites attention before it invites understanding. When you accept that such attention is intentional, you are freed from the need to explain yourself prematurely. Not every silence demands interpretation, and not every stare requires response. Your role is not to fill the quiet with justification, but to remain steady. Over time, consistency speaks more clearly than explanation ever could. The silence of others will either soften into respect or fade into indifference, but in both cases, it was never accidental. It was a reaction to something real, something they felt before they could name it. Difference has a way of announcing itself without raising its voice. Long before a person speaks, others sense whether they belong neatly within the expected pattern or whether they stand slightly apart from it. This difference is not usually rooted in appearance or talent alone, but in orientation, how a person thinks, chooses, and responds. When someone refuses to move at the pace of the crowd or declines to adopt its values simply to gain acceptance, that refusal becomes visible. It speaks louder than words because it alters the emotional temperature of a room. People feel it before they understand it, and feeling precedes explanation. Uncommon character is often mistaken for confidence, yet the two are not the same. Confidence can be learned, rehearsed, even performed. Character, however, reveals itself under pressure and over time. A person who does not exaggerate their achievements, who listens more than they speak, who chooses restraint where excess is encouraged, quietly signals a different set of priorities. These signals are powerful because they cannot be easily imitated. Anyone can adopt a tone or posture for a moment, but few can sustain a way of being that contradicts the dominant culture. That sustained difference unsettles others because it exposes how much of daily behavior is shaped by imitation rather than conviction. Discipline is another form of difference that rarely goes unnoticed. In environments where comfort is valued above growth, discipline appears almost unnatural. The person who rises early without complaint, who keeps promises even when no one is watching, or who refuses shortcuts that compromise integrity, becomes a silent question to everyone around them. Their actions imply that self-control is possible, and that implication carries weight. People may not voice their reaction, but they feel the contrast between effort and ease, between intention and impulse. Difference, in this sense, becomes a quiet rebuke, not because it condemns, but because it reveals. Purpose, when genuine, also speaks loudly without words. Many people live reactively, responding to circumstances rather than directing their lives. When someone acts with direction, even in small choices, it stands out. Purpose simplifies decisions, and that simplicity can look strange in a world accustomed to confusion. Others may watch closely, trying to determine whether this clarity is earned or naive, grounded or temporary. They remain silent, because admitting admiration would require them to ask themselves why their own lives feel scattered. Difference challenges not behavior first, but self-perception. It is also true that difference invites projection. People often assign meanings to what they do not understand. Your quiet may be interpreted as arrogance, your boundaries as coldness, your patience as weakness. These interpretations say more about the observer than the observed. Yet they arise precisely because difference demands explanation, and when facts are unavailable, assumptions fill the gap. Silence allows these assumptions to exist without being tested. Words would force correction or confrontation, and many prefer the comfort of their own narrative. Difference speaks loudly because it resists assimilation. Most social systems function by encouraging sameness, not through force, but through subtle reward and punishment. Approval is given to those who blend in, while discomfort greets those who do not. When someone remains unchanged by these pressures, it disrupts the system. Others notice and watch, wondering whether such resistance is sustainable or whether it will eventually give way. The watching is a form of evaluation, and the silence is a way to postpone judgment. Understanding this helps you carry difference wisely. If you mistake attention for hostility, you may harden unnecessarily. If you mistake it for admiration, you may become performative. But when you recognize that difference naturally draws observation, you can remain grounded. You are not required to diminish yourself to ease others, nor to exaggerate yourself to justify their attention. Difference does not need defense, it needs consistency. Over time, difference reveals its true nature. If it is rooted in ego, it collapses under pressure. If it is rooted in principle, it gains quiet respect. People may never articulate what they see, but they adjust their expectations accordingly. They learn what you will and will not compromise, how you respond when tested, and whether your values are stable. In this way, difference continues to speak, without speeches, without explanations, and without the need for recognition, simply by being lived. Silence often conceals far more than indifference. It frequently hides inner conflict that words are unwilling to expose. When people encounter someone whose presence stirs discomfort, admiration, or unease all at once, speech becomes dangerous. To speak would require clarity, and clarity would demand honesty. Many choose silence not because they have nothing to say, but because saying it would force them to confront tensions they have carefully learned to ignore. In such moments, quiet becomes a shield, protecting them from self-examination. Inner conflict arises when what a person sees challenges what they have settled for. Human beings are remarkably skilled at justifying their choices, especially the ones born from fear or convenience. These justifications work well until someone appears who embodies a different set of decisions. The contrast exposes the gap between what people believe they could be and what they have allowed themselves to become. This gap is uncomfortable. A spoken reaction would require them to acknowledge that the difference exists, so they remain silent, hoping the feeling will pass without demanding a response. Often, The conflict is not about you personally, but about what you represent. You may symbolize discipline to someone who avoids structure, courage to someone who postponed risk, or integrity to someone who learned to compromise early. Even if you never mention these qualities, they are felt. The mind recognizes patterns faster than language can form them. Silence allows the observer to process these patterns privately without revealing vulnerability. Speaking would expose the very struggle they are trying to keep hidden. There is also the fear of exposure through comparison. When people speak, they reveal their values, priorities, and insecurities. In the presence of someone who seems grounded or purposeful, this exposure feels risky. Silence offers distance. It allows them to watch without being seen, to evaluate without being evaluated. This dynamic creates the illusion of control, even as the internal conflict grows stronger. The quiet, then, is not peace, it is containment. Another layer of this silence comes from unresolved regret. Many people carry a quiet awareness of moments when they chose comfort over growth or approval over truth. These memories are often buried under routine and distraction. Encountering someone who appears to have chosen differently can bring these regrets to the surface. Words might invite conversation, and conversation might invite confession. Silence prevents the chain reaction. It keeps old decisions from being reopened and examined. Silence also functions as a form of delay. People often hope that by saying nothing, the discomfort will fade or the situation will resolve itself. They wait to see whether your consistency lasts or whether it is temporary. If you falter, their inner conflict dissolves into relief. If you remain steady, the conflict deepens. Speaking too early would commit them to a position they are not ready to take. Quiet observation buys time, even though it rarely brings resolution. It is important to recognize that this inner conflict is not always conscious. Many people are unaware of why they feel unsettled. They only know that something feels off or different. Without understanding the source, they cannot articulate a response. Silence becomes the default reaction to confusion. This is why attempts to explain yourself often fail. The issue is not misunderstanding, but unpreparedness. They are not ready to name what they feel, let alone discuss it. Understanding that silence often masks inner conflict prevents you from misinterpreting it as judgment or disinterest. It is not always a verdict on your worth or behavior. More often, it is evidence that your presence has activated something unresolved in the other person. Your role is not to resolve their conflict for them. That work belongs to them. Attempting to draw them out or demand a response can increase their resistance. When you remain steady in the face of such silence, you offer something rare, a non-threatening example. You show that it is possible to live with clarity without forcing it on others. Over time, some will find the courage to speak, ask questions, or change. Others will drift away, choosing familiarity over discomfort. In both cases, their silence was never empty. It was filled with questions they were not yet ready to answer. Being chosen is often misunderstood as a mark of distinction, when in truth it is a summons to responsibility. People tend to romanticize the idea of being set apart, imagining it as evidence of superiority or favor. Yet in reality, standing out places a greater demand on one's conduct. Visibility magnifies influence, and influence, whether intended or not, shapes others. When people watch you closely, it is not an invitation to feel elevated, but an obligation to live with care. The weight of being noticed is not comfort, it is accountability. Responsibility begins with restraint. When attention follows you, every reaction carries more meaning than you might intend. Words spoken casually can mislead, and actions taken lightly can encourage imitation. This is why those who are truly set apart often appear reserved rather than flamboyant. They understand that freedom without wisdom becomes recklessness when others are watching. To be responsible is to recognize that your life is not lived in isolation, even when you wish it were. Your choices ripple outward, shaping perceptions of what is acceptable, possible, or admirable. Ego thrives on attention, but responsibility is wary of it. The moment a person begins to enjoy being watched for its own sake, They subtly shift their motivation. Actions become performances, and integrity gives way to image management. Responsibility demands the opposite posture. It calls for consistency, even when no one is looking, and humility when everyone is. It asks you to resist the temptation to believe that visibility grants permission to act without consequence. In truth, it increases the cost of every misstep. Another aspect of responsibility is patience. People who are watched are often expected to have answers, to explain themselves, or to justify their path. Yet responsible living recognizes that not all questions deserve immediate response. Some truths are better demonstrated than defended. To rush into explanation can cheapen what should be revealed through time and consistency. Responsibility is comfortable with being misunderstood for a season, trusting that clarity emerges through conduct rather than persuasion. There is also the responsibility of self-examination. Being set apart does not mean being exempt from error. On the contrary, it requires heightened awareness of one's own weaknesses. When influence grows, so does the potential for harm. Responsible individuals regularly question their motives, asking whether their choices serve truth or merely reinforce their identity. This inward vigilance guards against hypocrisy, which is the quickest way to undermine credibility. Responsibility extends beyond personal behavior to the way others are treated. When people look to you, even silently, they are observing not only what you do, but how you respond to those with less visibility. Do you remain kind when there is nothing to gain? Do you exercise fairness when advantage is available? These moments reveal whether distinction has refined your character or inflated your sense of self. True responsibility expresses itself in how power, however small, is handled. Being chosen also means accepting solitude without resentment. Responsibility often isolates because it limits participation in behaviors that compromise values. While others may indulge without thought, you are aware of consequences. This awareness can feel burdensome, but it is part of the calling. To resent it is to misunderstand it. Responsibility is not punishment, it is trust. It implies that you are capable of carrying weight without becoming bitter. Responsibility demands endurance. Attention fades, admiration shifts, and silence returns, but the obligation remains. Living responsibly is not a moment of recognition. It is a lifelong practice. It requires choosing what is right when it is inconvenient, unseen, or unrewarded. Those who embrace this reality discover that being chosen was never about standing above others. It was about standing firm, so that others might see what steadiness looks like when it is lived, not claimed.